at 150 plus, public opinion and vulnerable group experiences. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation is very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Keith Neuman, Executive Director of the Environics Institute. He will guide us through the research findings and answer your questions on this important topic. But a few words before we begin. As always, the first portion of our webinar will be given to the presentation. You'll have the opportunity to type your questions as they occur to you, but we will hold all questions until the end. While the presentation is going on, we'll attempt to group the questions together to make sure we answer as many as possible. So please don't feel ignored if you don't hear a precise question asked. It's just us doing some mashups in the background. So let's begin. Canada has an international reputation as a diverse, inclusive society, which in some respects is well-deserved and in others falls far short. This presentation will address how Canada is doing today in realizing this aspiration from the perspective of both broad public opinion and the personal experiences of individuals from racialized and religious minorities. Keith, welcome, and please take us through the report.
Thank you, Len. Thank you for the kind introduction. Welcome to all of you who are joining this webinar from wherever it is that you happen to be sitting today. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you today about inclusiveness in Canada. I hope you find the material valuable and we're spending the next hour or so with us. What we will cover today in the hour or so that we have is really to address the question I think that Len started with, is how inclusive is Canada today as a society that accepts, if not embraces, the diversity of the people in this country? And really to address this specifically in terms of looking at some empirical evidence that we can bring to the table to see what sort of insights we can get from that in terms of demography, politics, public opinion, and lived experience. And then wrap up with some conclusions and further insights to help us appreciate what we're looking at. And once I'm done, I look forward to your questions and comments. So how inclusive are we in Canada today as a country, as a society? By inclusiveness, I guess I mean accepting, if not embracing, the different diverse types of people and individuals in our country, our communities, and in our homes. So that's really what I want to tackle today and spend the next bit of time talking about. Okay. So I think a starting point for us is to talk about what I would describe as three competing narratives in Canada today with respect to immigration, diversity, multiculturalism, and pluralism. So what are the three narratives? The first narrative, perhaps the most predominant, could be summarized by the phrase, we're really great, diversity is our strength. This is, I think, again, the narrative that we typically hear in this country. Diversity makes us strong. We certainly see a lot of rhetoric, politicians and leaders and so forth, and in some cases actions as well, whether it's pride parades, the makeup of the federal cabinet, welcoming refugees from Syria, and various other things that tell us that, in fact, we're a very welcoming, inclusive society that we should celebrate. But there is a counter narrative, and the second narrative, perhaps not quite as strong, but in a sense reacting to the first, that basically says maybe we're not so great after all. Let's not kid ourselves. There's a history of colonialism and racism in this country. Today, there's the history, but today we're dealing with Islamophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, sexism, and so forth. And there are lots of events and activities and things that we may look to indicate that this is a reality that we're also dealing with in this country. So perhaps a different narrative than the first. But important to point out that this narrative is aligned with the first one in terms of the ideal direction and where it is we want to be. And in that sense, this narrative is saying we're not so great, but we can and should be better. And finally, there's a third narrative, one that perhaps isn't as evident, publicly anyway. And this narrative it starts with a very different premise, and that is that Canada is already too inclusive, and that the country should be less inclusive, less accepting. We should return to a past age that's imagined. Certainly there's evidence of this narrative, although not as noticeable, whether it's activities directed against minorities such as Muslims, anti-immigrant protests, or small organizations like Proud Boy and so forth. Again, this is largely in the shadows in many respects, but it is clearly evident in our country, and we need to be mindful of that. So what do we make of these three narratives? Which one is right? It's not perhaps a question of what is right, but what is happening. How do we sift through these and get a sense of, more broadly, how Canadians feel and act about the diversity in this country? This is where I want to devote most of my remarks. And I want to present and discuss empirical evidence of various kinds, demographic, political, and so forth, that will help us answer this question. Let me start very briefly, and I will only cover this in a couple of slides, in terms of the demographic landscape of our country. And some of what I will speak to you about may be self-evident, but very important and valuable to see the actual numbers, and you may not have seen all of these. And the first slide really is to show the extent to which Canada has always been to some degree, but is more now than ever a country of immigrants. Today, or in 2016, 22% of the people living in Canada were born in another country. As we can see from the slide, the yellow bars, that number has been increasing steadily, consistently over time. The proportion of the population that's foreign-born is now at the level it was in the 1920s and early 1930s. And importantly, the slide also shows the projected change over the next 20 years or so. And what we could see is this number is going to continue to rise, and by 2036 it will be close to 30% of the population. So we have been, but increasingly become, a nation of people that have come from elsewhere. It's also important to consider the second-generation Canadians. And on this slide, I'm showing you the proportion of the population that's first or second generation in the major cities in this country. These are numbers from the 2016 census, and they're really quite remarkable. What they show is that more than 4 in 10 Canadians, that's 4 in 10, have either been born in another country or the children of parents born in another country. That's quite a significant number. Toronto and Vancouver, 70% or more, large majorities. And even in such cities as Victoria, Winnipeg, London, Ontario, more than 4 in 10 are first or second generation. This is really quite striking if you think about it, and is perhaps unique in the world as a country, certainly the countries that we compare ourselves with, in terms of the proportion of people that have come from other countries and a diverse number of other countries. So, you know, in demographic terms, we are by definition inclusive in the sense that we are a population of people who are very diverse and, in a sense, living together from our different backgrounds. Let me turn again briefly to the political landscape. Excuse me, this flows from the demographic reality that I've just discussed. Here's another, some other remarkable numbers that I think are important. Excuse me. That Parliament today in Ottawa now includes 46 foreign-born MPs, up from 42 in the last election, and the largest number in our history. 46 may not seem like a large number. Out of 338, it's about 14%. So, you know, it's not quite as high as the 22% of immigrants in this country, but it's quite a remarkable number, in part because there are foreign-born MPs in every party except for the Bloc Québécois, and until they did at one point have a foreign-born MP. So it's not just one party that has foreign-born MPs, it's all parties. But what really is remarkable is that this proportion, this representation, is not found anywhere else in the world. There's no other country that has a democratically elected parliament that has such a significant number of people born in another country. Look at the USA, for instance. There are 535 members of the US Congress. None of them were born in another country, apart from maybe perhaps being born to American parents on an army base. You could look at a country like Australia, where there's actually a law prohibiting citizenship in other countries if you're in their parliament. So it is really quite striking. And I think the significance is that if you sit back and consider what it takes to become an MP in a country like Canada, coming from another country and getting established, and then establishing yourself and having a career and connecting with a community and establishing a profile and a level of support that allows you to be nominated by a major party and then elected, that's quite a road for somebody to travel who has started off living somewhere else. So this is very significant in terms of our political culture. And an impact on how elections turn out. The other important statistic that I want to show in this respect is the extent to which people coming to this country end up becoming citizens. Over 80% of immigrants coming to Canada prior to 2012 are now citizens. They've chosen to become part of this country, and the country has welcomed them. Again, this is an incredibly high number when you compare it to most other countries in the world. And the significance is that once people become citizens, they become engaged and they vote. So what this means is that we aren't just a country of immigrants, but we're a country of immigrants who are now part of the political culture. And I think it helps explain why Canada is probably the only country in Western world, so to speak, that doesn't have a national or provincial party that is a so-called anti-immigrant party, as we see in many other countries. Regardless of other aspects of the political spectrum and politics, there's no major party in Canada that is actively advocating a reduction in the number of immigrants or refugees. Let me turn now to public opinion. And this is really the major part that I want to focus on. How do Canadians think and feel about the country's diversity and the people who may be different from themselves? And we have a fair amount of evidence from our own research that I'd like to speak to. And just to be clear about where it comes from and our institute, the Environics Institute for Survey Research, where I work, is a nonprofit public interest research institute that was formed about 12 years ago. And we do public opinion surveys and social research on issues not usually looked at, asking questions not usually asked, and doing studies with communities that are not often well understood. And we're doing this kind of research to help understand better who we are as Canadians and where we're going. So this just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and where this research is coming from, and also to clarify that our institute isn't formally associated with other companies with the Environics name. So we do nonprofit research. All of the research that I'm going to be presenting today is publicly available on our website, and you can certainly follow up with us if you want further information. So let's talk about public opinion in Canada. Before I turn to our own research, I want to go back a few generations to appreciate where we've come from. And I'm showing a slide here that from a survey that Gallup conducted in 1946 with Canadians, asking them about what sorts of nationalities Canadians would like to see kept out of the country. What we can see here is a good indication of the legacy of xenophobia and racism that Canada used to have. Significant numbers who do not want to see Japanese, Jewish, German, and so forth people coming into this country. This is just after World War II and indicates that many Canadians would like to keep, wanted to see Canada remain as it was. And jumping ahead to another Gallup survey in 1961, about 15 years later, asking about restrictions to non-whites coming to this country, and here we see a small majority of Canadians telling Gallup that such restrictions, which were in place at the time, should remain in place. So I think it's important to understand the history and where we've come from, and this survey was done not that many years ago. But after this point, the country did start to change. So today, and I'm showing a slide that actually shows this transition, I think, very well. This slide shows Environics surveys that were conducted starting in 1977 and continually through this year, asking on a consistent basis the same question. Do you agree or disagree there is too much immigration in Canada today? What we could see is a real sea change of opinion. Back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, most Canadians agreed and felt there was too much immigration. But you could see how that started to change quite dramatically in the mid to late 1990s. And now we consistently have a majority of Canadians that reject this argument, this premise. And even through the recent economic recession a few years ago, that did not really change public opinion. I think part of what we're seeing here is what we know from our other research that tells us that for the most part, Canadians do not see immigrants or immigration as a threat to the economy or their own jobs. That's very different in some other countries. What about refugees? We could see a similar shift in public opinion with respect to refugee claimants. The statement that we asked on the survey, do you agree or disagree? Too many refugee claimants are not legitimate. We could see that back a few decades ago, a strong majority of Canadians agreed that there were in fact too many illegitimate refugee claimants. But look how that number has been declining steadily over time. And now it's a minority. And a greater proportion now disagree with the statement and believe that, in fact, refugee claimants are, for the most part, legitimate. Again, so you can see a real noticeable change in perspective over time. What about immigrants being good citizens? We asked a question on 3 separate surveys from 2011 through 2016. Can someone born outside Canada be just as likely to be a good citizen as someone born here? And we could see consistently that Canadians 9 and 10 answer yes, that in fact, coming from another country does not disqualify you from being just as good a citizen as someone that was born here. This is not an opinion we would have seen 50 years ago. And the change that we're seeing is not simply about tolerance and sort of accepting people that perhaps we need to or want to accept, but also a matter of pride and identity. Here are the results of a survey we asked, a public opinion survey we asked 2 years ago, asking the question, what makes Canada unique? And what's important to point out is this was what we call an unprompted question, which means excuse me, that we asked the question but did not offer response categories. And it's quite striking that when we ask this question, what Canadians are most likely to tell us that it's our multiculturalism, our pluralism, our diversity, and our welcoming of people from elsewhere, which is what really makes our country unique, 43%. Land geography, healthcare, weather and climate, hockey, those sorts of things, yes, those are mentioned, but no longer sort of how we are defining ourselves as a country. And again, that's something that's very different from what we would have seen before. And on another set of surveys, we asked Canadians what they felt was the most positive contribution Canada can make as a country to the world today, unprompted responses. What I'm showing you are the top responses over a period of time going back 25 years. It has been for much of the past few generations that when you ask this question, it was peacekeeping and perhaps foreign aid, which were the contributions that Canadians were identifying as what we can do in the world. But look at our results from 2018, which we just published a few months ago, that it's now our multiculturalism, our welcoming of immigrants and refugees that is unprompted now more likely to be the response that we're going to be given. Of course, there have been recent events over the past couple of years that will help explain this, our sponsoring of Syrian refugees and so forth. But nevertheless, those events are starting to change the Canadian mindset and our view about being inclusive. As you know, a couple of years ago, Canada stepped up and started accepting a significant number of refugees from Syria, 2015 and 2016. We asked Canadians on a survey a few months ago whether they had a direct involvement in the Syrian refugee sponsorship program, private sponsorship, in some capacity directly, or do they know someone who's involved? And these results are really quite striking. 7% of adult Canadians, that's about 2 million, said that they were directly involved in the sponsorship of the Syrian family. So this may have been as individuals or a family, or perhaps as part of a church or synagogue group, so not as individuals, but part of a group. Another 25% say they know somebody or knew somebody who had this kind of contact. So that's 32%, 1 in 3 Canadians were touched or directly involved some way in the Syrian refugee sponsorship program. And on this slide, we show the results by region across the country, and what we can see is that this involvement was across the country. We know it was involved across the demographic spectrum as well, and really I think is quite a significant indicator of the extent to which people's sensitivity and sentiment and openness to Syrian refugees goes beyond simply saying nice words. And how do we compare in terms of our inclusiveness and views about immigrants and refugees compare with other countries in the world? We're able to look at some international data from Gallup, from the world poll that they conducted in 2017 and before, where they put something together they called the Migrant Acceptance Index. Over the box on the right will tell you how that was developed. It's responses to questions about whether the people think it's a good idea that immigrants live in your country, become your neighbor, or marry a close relative. And on this index, if you look across Canada and the other OECD countries, you can see that Canada is near the top of the list in acceptance. Not at the top. There are 2 island nations, Iceland and New Zealand, that are marginally higher. But we are near the top in terms of acceptance. Other countries, such as the USA, are somewhat lower. And in the bottom of the list, we see Eastern European countries, countries such as Turkey and Greece, where the acceptance of migrants is significantly lower. So it's useful to put us in an international context and understand the fact that we do stand out in some respects. There are different ways that this could be measured. Another way of looking at it was recently published by Ipsos in their Public Perspective series, data that was recently released where they measured inclusiveness along a number of measures, religious, the second generation, LGBTQ, and so forth. And on this index, Canada, out of 27 countries, scores at the top of the list, an index score of 55 out of 100. United States, in this case, close behind, and then you can see where the other countries fall from there. So again, we look at this data both in Canada and internationally, and it tells a pretty positive story of public acceptance and pride even in our inclusiveness and our diversity. But that's not quite the whole story, and we need to balance this out. We also know from our long-term tracking research that Canadians have been and continue to be concerned about how well immigrants are fitting into our country, how well they're integrating and adopting Canadian values, whatever those might be. Here we see results of surveys conducted over the past 25 years and asking people to agree or disagree. Too many immigrants do not adopt Canadian values. What we see is that consistently a majority of Canadians agree with that statement, and they feel that too many immigrants are not doing this. Although it's important to see as well that since 2012, that proportion has been going down and is actually at the lowest point it's been since we started measuring this. What may be behind that? I think a number of things. Part of it may simply be the composition of the population, which gradually over time is becoming a larger proportion of first and second generation. So I think this also points to one of the areas where there's some tension and sensitivity. And it's a good segue to our fourth and final section, where I want to turn to the lived experience of people in Canada in terms of inclusiveness and acceptance. So, you know, it's certainly important to look at majority attitudes, but we also need to hear from those people from groups that may be either new to the country or vulnerable in some other way, and understand their perspective on inclusiveness. On this, I want to draw from several studies that our institute have done over the past few years, community studies that we have done with the Muslims across Canada, with urban indigenous population across 11 cities, a study that we released a few years ago, and most recently a major study with the Black community in the Greater Toronto Area. So these are studies where we've actually done in-depth research with people who are in these communities in a way where we can understand and speak to their experience being in this country. Let's start with Muslims. We actually did 2 surveys of Muslims in Canada, one in 2006 and another one 10 years later in 2016. One of the questions we asked on the survey, we asked Muslims is, do you think that Muslims in Canada are treated better, worse, or about the same as they are treated in other Western countries? And what we could see here from both surveys is that a strong majority, in answer to this question, feel in fact that Muslims in Canada, including themselves, are treated better than in other countries in Europe, the United States, and so forth. And that actually improved a bit from 2006 to 2016. So a fairly positive response in relative terms, but that's not, that doesn't mean everything is fine. One of the other questions was about their own personal experience with discrimination or unfair treatment because of their religion or ethnicity or for other reasons. And what you see on the slide is a response to that question. Over to the left, this is the proportion who have had negative experience for any reason. It's 35%, the dark green bar. 1 in 3 Muslims say they've experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly in the past 5 years. You can see it's primarily because of their religion or ethnicity, and to a lesser extent their language or their sex. So those are not insignificant numbers. And the light blue bars are comparison data for the population at whole collected from Statistics Canada, and show that overall they are significantly less likely as a whole to experience discrimination, especially because of religion. Only 5% of Canadians have say they've experienced that, and of course this includes other ethnicities as well that we know also experience these kinds of problems. So Muslims disproportionately do experience discrimination and unfair treatment, and so we are documenting that. Where they're experiencing discrimination, we've measured happens in various settings over time. Certainly due to religion, we can see in the workplace and public spaces, stores, banks, and restaurants, and universities, and schools, and so forth. It's evident that that this kind of experience happens in a variety of settings for Muslims who live in this country. What about the future? We wanted to ask Muslims how they viewed the future in Canada in terms of whether they've experienced more or less or about the same amount of discrimination. Are things looking up or not? If we look over to the left, we asked about the next generation of Muslims and what they would be facing. Certainly no consensus here, but 35% felt that Muslims would be facing more discrimination than before versus 29% less, and then the others said the same or couldn't say. So not necessarily a very optimistic expectation or anticipation. And when we look at that face more result by age cohort, what's striking here is it's the youngest age cohort, those Muslims 18 to 34, who are the most pessimistic, are most likely to feel that discrimination may get worse rather than better. Perhaps a surprising finding, but important to understand in the context here that Muslims in this country, 70% are immigrants, and the young generation are primarily Canadian-born. So young Muslims have been born in this country, and I think have been brought up to expect that they have the same rights and privileges and position in society as other Canadians. And so they've got a different set of expectations and maybe a little more critical about how their community is being treated in this country, and then perhaps maybe a little less positive about what they see in the future. But I think it's very sobering to see these results and suggest that we have a long way to go. Let me turn now to our Indigenous population in our cities. These data come from a study that's in 11 cities across the country. We asked Indigenous peoples how they feel they're being viewed by non-Indigenous Canadians, and over on the left, it's pretty striking to see that 71% believe that they're generally viewed as negative. Should be no surprise, we know that there's a very troubled history in this country and a very difficult legacy, and that the issues and challenges persist. We know that from various sources. This research, I think, puts some numbers on it. It helps us measure it more significantly from the Indigenous perspective. Over on the right, we asked people whether they think that these impressions have changed over the past decade. And while 40% feel that there has been some progress and maybe better, a majority feel it's no different or possibly worse. So again, a slow progress over time. And Indigenous peoples, I would say, are painfully aware of the stereotypes that are applied to them by other Canadians. In this question, we asked them what they believe the most common stereotypes are that are held towards them. Again, these are unprompted responses. And it's quite striking. Addiction problems in particular, 74% believe that that is a stereotype laid on them. Being lazy, uneducated, on social assistance, unemployed, and so forth. This is very difficult. It was difficult, actually, for our survey respondents to articulate this. It was difficult for Indigenous audiences to look at these results, and it's an ongoing burden that they carry in terms of how they feel they're being seen. And also, perhaps not surprising, but the numbers are very high, that in terms of personal experience, 89% agree that others behave in an unfair or negative way towards Aboriginal people in Canada today, and 7 in 10, 70%, say they've been teased or insulted because of their background. That is a very high percentage when you consider it. Let me turn now to the Black community in the Greater Toronto Area from a study that we released just last year that we spent a number of years doing. And again, no surprise perhaps to many of you that discrimination and racism is a common experience for people who identify as Black. A majority say that they frequently or occasionally experience unfair treatment due to race, to who they are by race. Almost very, very few say this never happens. And I think what's important on this slide is that we can see that this experience is really equally likely for men and women and for people across different income strata. I think it's important to emphasize this point because the common stereotype is that the challenges are primarily Black men and perhaps younger Black men or Black men with lower socioeconomic status. And what I think the Black community understands, and I think everyone else needs to understand, that this experience is not limited to those parts of that community. Discrimination takes many forms. One aspect is what is known as microaggressions. These are sort of day-to-day slights that may not be dramatic, but nevertheless are smaller ways in which people are not treated well or disrespected. We asked several types of microaggressions and found that these are very commonly experienced across the population. Whether it's being mistaken for someone else, being treated rudely or disrespectfully, being ignored or not given service in a restaurant or store, being observed or followed while in a public place such as a store, being treated in an overly friendly or superficial way, or to have expectations for your work to be lower because they think you're not capable. So I think anecdotally it was always clear that this was the reality. I think this research demonstrates, and this is across a representative sample, that this is part of their life. Of course, the experience with discrimination, unfair treatment doesn't affect everybody the same way. Some people are significantly bothered and even traumatized by the kind of day-to-day experiences they have. Other people can slough it off and not be affected too much and almost kind of ignore it sometimes. And others may be inspired to rise to the challenge and kind of push back and take action or become engaged politically to do something about it. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the impact and the consequence of this kind of experience doesn't affect everybody in quite the same way. Certainly in Toronto and perhaps in some other cities, there have been ongoing controversies about the treatment that police forces have been giving to Black population. So on our survey, we asked a number of questions about experiences with police services. And here are some results that may not be surprising to many of you, but are nevertheless quite significant. We asked about lifetime personal experience with police in their community in a number of ways. Positive ways, the ones highlighted in green, negative ways, ones highlighted in red. And significant numbers have had experience with police, both positive and negative. But I think it's the negative numbers that stand out. Getting stopped by police in public places, 55% of everyone in the Black community, 79% among those 25 to 44, men, 8 in 10. Being harassed or treated rudely by police, almost 4 in 10, generally 60% of men aged 25 to 44 being arrested. So these are very significant numbers when you think about a population like this, and certainly suggest that there are some significant issues with interactions between police and this community. And I think one of the other notable findings in this research is that having a good income, being higher up in the socioeconomic ladder, is really no insulation for people who are Black in terms of negative experiences with police in the GTA. People with higher incomes are just as likely to report being stopped, to being harassed, and to have force used against you. So again, this notion that these issues are primarily with certain segments of the population who perhaps are getting into trouble or somehow partly responsible for this experience, I think is certainly not borne out with the research. And perhaps not surprisingly, and similar to the results that we have with our Indigenous survey, when we asked people on our survey, people from the Black community, how they feel non-Black people see them, most 80% believe that they are seen as negative, seen in a negative light rather than a positive light. That is how they feel they're being viewed. And whether there's improvement or not over the past decade, in fact, the numbers are less positive than for the Indigenous population. Only 1 in 4 feel that there's been clear progress. And finally, one further slide on this topic. Near the end of the survey, we asked people from the Black community what they would like broader society to understand about Black people. And again, this was an open-ended question. We wanted to give our respondents the opportunity to identify for us what they thought was important. And I think these results, again, are quite striking. Number one on this list, the major theme was they want us to understand that Black people are the same as everyone else. So clearly, I think the sense is that they don't think that that understanding is there. 57% felt that that was significant for people to understand. They want the rest of the community to understand that the media portrayal of their community is largely inaccurate and distorted, that there's great diversity in their population, not all the same, about the history and the legacy of discrimination and racism that's taken place, and various other types of aspects of who they are that they feel need to be better understood. So I think that the results, the evidence that we have in our lived experience section, I think provided a significant counterpoint to what we saw in the public opinion data that I showed you. So let's come back to our question. What does the evidence tell us about how inclusive we are as Canadians? Well, as you can imagine, it's not a really clear answer. There certainly is a positive story. Majority of Canadians, I think we can say, are accepting, if not supportive, of immigrants and refugees and people who are different. At least in aspirations, they would like to be accepting, if not, if they don't fully live it out in their own lives. This is where they feel that they ought to be or would like to be. I think it's positive that opinions have held steady despite recent trends and events happening in the USA, in Europe, and elsewhere. Certainly economic ups and downs and populism and other sorts of things that in other countries, I think we've seen declining tolerance towards people who are different. It's very significant that if we look at our trend data, we can see that Canadians have come a long way in just a generation or two in a positive direction in terms of being tolerant and accepting and even taking pride in seeing the country as being one that's around pluralism and diversity. And I think it's important to point out, and I didn't have a chance to show you the results of this, but we also found in our surveys that immigrants themselves, newcomers to this country, when we ask them about their aspirations, they, for the most part, want to do their part to be part of Canada, to be good citizens, to largely adopt the kinds of Canadian values and priorities that other Canadians already have, and that there is not a divide in the perspectives or the agendas of immigrants and native-born, that for the most part, they generally see this country and aspirations that are very similar, and second generation in particular, very close to native-born. So some very positive things I think we can say. But we also have a negative story. Many people, in the majority certainly, sometimes struggle with the reality of people who are different, who look different or act differently because of their religion or their race or their behavior. It's difficult to accept them or to feel comfortable with them. And some differences are more comfortable than others. I think some people coming from some countries probably have a very easy time and there are little issues. And from other countries, certainly countries, Muslim countries or countries with different ethnic makeup, there's less comfort. And within the population in Canada, some Canadians are just more tolerant and easier to accept diversity than others. So there is a range in terms of the level of acceptance and inclusiveness that people are able to bring. And of course, there is a minority in our population where the issue is not just about discomfort or minor prejudice, but there's anger and hate and acting out, and people that go to the step of actually taking negative actions in terms of vandalism and violence. Fortunately, very rare, but they are emboldened to act, and this is also part of the Canadian story, which we struggle with. So, what can we conclude? I think the conclusion is really not very satisfying in the end. We, of course, long for a single story and a clear narrative, and that's certainly, I think, what we typically hear. We're a good country, we're a bad country. Where are we? And I think this ambivalence, this mix, I think, divides us in a way. Clearly, the narratives are very different as we started. I think some people think and believe very clearly that we're exceptionally tolerant and positive, and that's where we are. And others will argue just as strongly that we're colonial racists and we have a terrible past and it's with us, and perhaps we're really not so good. So the challenge for us in the end really is to recognize and acknowledge these different parts of our society collectively and these parts of ourselves. Because I expect many of us are also ambivalent ourselves within us in terms of how we feel about some of these issues, about different groups in our society. And that really is sort of the point at which we come to. And then it comes down to determining what standard we may want to hold to ourselves and what's possible to achieve. Because we're left, I guess, perhaps in a bit of a quandary. And I guess another way to consider this is that there's a balancing act that we collectively and perhaps individually are faced with if we choose to do so. That on the one hand, we celebrate our rich diversity and the progress we have made and take pride in our country for what we've accomplished and in our communities, and the fact that in many cases we do get along and we live harmoniously and we're not divided into warring camps and communities that are divided, but at the same time also acknowledge not only our history and our legacy, but the current reality that we're still dealing in terms of lack of inclusiveness and acceptance. And not only acknowledge it, but to somehow find a way to be a contributing force towards positive change. So in the end, it's not a very conclusive conclusion, but I think that it's perhaps useful and valuable to appreciate the nuance, and to see the evidence that might help lead to this conclusion and this balance, and to have that evidence sort of underpin our own perspective going forward. Now, before I finish, I'd just like to make a few further concluding insights, three in particular, perhaps to add a bit more insight and understanding about understanding public opinion and social change that I think is useful in the context of the issues that we've been discussing. So this is where I would like to finish up. So the first of the three insights is to emphasize the point that the public, so to speak, is not one thing. I think typically what we see, what we hear, what we think about is what the public thinks, what Canadians think, as if it's one collective, singular opinion of what we think and who we are. But in fact, public opinion almost always consists of different and often divergent perspectives. That on the rare question, there may be consensus, for instance, our question about being a good citizen. But as you saw in our research, there's a diversity of views on many topics. So the overall picture, even with the results I showed you, is really only the starting point. And really, to properly understand where Canadians are in any of these issues, it's essential to go deeper and understand how opinions and values are similar or different across the population. Now, I did not do a very good job in my presentation to get into that nuance, but that's a function of the time I had and what it is I had to present. But I'm making the point now to maybe emphasize the point that it's really essential to understand in looking at these issues that not all Canadians share the view, and even on any one question, there may be important regional or demographic differences or other sorts of aspects which we'd want to properly understand to fully appreciate what it is we're seeing. And I think in terms of what's important to be done by us and others is to really make sure that the kind of research and evidence that's being done has the nuance, and that there's enough appreciation of this to try and avoid overly simplified and distorting narratives that try and come to conclusions that say Canadians are this or Canadians are that. Let me give you a brief example of what I mean by this. Survey that we conducted a couple of years ago about opinions about Indigenous peoples from the perspective of non-Indigenous Canadians. And what I'm showing you here is a typology that illustrates the fact that if you ask the question, what is the general perspective that non-Indigenous Canadians have towards Indigenous peoples, broadly speaking, there isn't just one perspective. In fact, what we found in our research is 5 very distinct perspectives, and we've labeled these based on being positive or negative about Indigenous peoples and whether people are informed or uninformed. And each of these perspectives is distinct and separate from the others. And so if we're trying to answer the question, what do the Canadian majority think about Indigenous peoples, we can't simply give one answer. There are at least 5 answers to that question, and we need to appreciate that. The second insight, and this one may be self-evident to many of you, is that if we're talking about people relating to others who are different, people who are other, personal contact makes a significant difference. The extent to which people have personal, meaningful contact with people who are very different from themselves by ethnicity or religion or race really makes a difference. The more meaningful contact you have, the more you will recognize those people as individuals like yourself and that you have things in common. It may be self-evident or common sense, but it is a very important point to emphasize and significant because it suggests that opportunities to promote such meaningful contact can make a real difference. Just some evidence from our research just to illustrate the point. When we asked the Canadian public about their overall impression of the religion of Islam, we could see here that those who have frequent contact with Muslims are much more positive than those who do not. And oftentimes we see in our research with Muslims that sort of negative opinions tend to be expressed most strongly in smaller rural communities where there's much less likely to be any contact or issues with Muslims in a direct way. And the final point I'd like to make is around social norms. So, you know, most of what I presented, certainly in the public opinion dimension, is what people think and believe, what they value. That's certainly very important to measure and makes a difference. But at some level, ultimately, how people behave matters more. What they actually do in dealing with other people, how they behave in the public sphere. And that's what we mean by social norms. Social norms are informal norms that we all abide by and are aware of that kind of sets boundaries around how people actually behave. People may have particular attitudes, say negative attitudes towards particular groups and societies, but where there's strong social norms, people may understand that acting on those biases is not acceptable, and more often than not, they will not do so. This is important because the core values and attitudes that people hold are pretty resistant to change. It takes a lot for those to change over time. But the normative behavior can be influenced much more easily. And this is where there's an opportunity to actually make a difference in society. Reinforcing social norms against inhospitable behavior is something that certainly can be addressed through policy and programs and other measures. I think an excellent example of that is sort of the strategies over the past few generations towards smoking behavior, and particularly smoking in public places. Those of you who are older certainly remember a time when smoking in public was widely acceptable in Canada and widely practiced, and smoking generally was a positive rather than a negative. And we all could see how that's changed quite dramatically over time. And just to finish with, I guess, another example of how social norms in Canada have changed. Question over the last 25 years about acceptance of LGBTQ rights. should society regard people of same sex who live together as being the same as a married couple? If you look at the dark green line, you can see in 1992, only 35% of Canadians agreed with that statement. That has now more than doubled as of 2016, 73%. And the dotted lines are those over or under 35 years of age. And I'm showing that just to show that this change over time is not just generational replacement. It's not just older people leaving and younger people coming into the sample. Attitudes have changed at every age cohort over time. There has been a significant social change in outlook towards LGBT community and issues, which is more dramatic than we usually see. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that this change is not simply a change because people's attitudes sort of evolved, but social norms around treatment of this community changed dramatically in Canada, partly as a result of legal changes over time, and I think is a terrific example how social norms can and do change in a positive direction. And I want to end with this image of a lawn sign that spotted recently on someone's front lawn, which is showing that someone is making a clear statement publicly about where they stand about inclusiveness. And they want to tell everyone where they stand, and in a sense, what they are doing is stating and reinforcing a social norm around acceptance of diversity inclusion. And you know, putting out a sign like this is simply a small step, but it's many, many steps like this that can make a big difference in shaping how our society can function. And on that note, I'd like to finish my presentation and want to thank you for listening, and now interested in questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Keith. Before we begin the Q&A section, I just want to confirm, would you like your camera turned on or would you like it off?
For me, you can turn my camera on.
All righty. Let's do the miracle of technology. Like I said, through the miracle of technology.
Turn on.
Okay. Should be on. It should be on. Well, Ron says it is, and I believe it. Okay, so before we get to the questions, just a couple of housekeeping matters, Keith. So we had a number of our participants ask if the survey was available online, so if there are links that people can use, and also would it be possible for you to share the slides of your presentation?
Good question, thank you. The answers, all of the studies that I've reported are available on the Environics Institute website. I believe the URL is at the bottom of the slide, environicsinstitute.org. Our website, you can go through the project list. All of the reports are there and other information, and data files can be available as well, so everything is available. As for the slides, I believe the webinar will be made publicly available on your website. And for people that want the actual deck itself, we would be happy to make that available as well.
Superb. Thank you very much, Keith. Also, one of the comments that came in while you were speaking from a self-described or a self-confessed political nerd is that there are, in fact, a number of U.S. politicians in the Congress who were foreign-born.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so while you were speaking, their fingers were doing the walking, and okay, so and that information was shared just for the next time you offer your presentation.
Well, point noted. I guess my only question is how many of them were born on U.S. Army bases, but we'll be good to have that corrected. I think it's unlikely that it's more than a couple % within the U.S. Congress, but good to know. Thank you.
No, not a problem. Thank you, Keith. Okay, so to the questions, and again, we do. Yes, just one moment while I lean forward. Okay, so thanks for the usual informative overview as well as the specific community insights. One comment or question. While Canadian political parties all support immigration in general, the potential wedge issue pertains to refugees, particularly the asylum seekers. Pardon me, the screen just moved. Potential dangers to this, and what insights does some of your polling show?
Good question. I think that, first off, there's been relatively little research done specifically about asylum seekers because it hasn't really been on the political map until very recently. So I think most of the research that we're looking at looks at immigrants or refugees. Now, asylum seekers, I think, probably would be viewed as refugees to some extent. Certainly with respect to refugees, I think Canadian public opinion has been, for the most part, positive, and I think certainly with the response to Syrian refugees is instructive and suggests that much more positive than negative, and I think that applies largely to people across the political spectrum for the most part, some parties more than others. At the same time, I think the issue at our border with the U.S. is a relatively recent issue, just in the last year or so, and I think the issue is unfolding as we speak. And I think how it will unfold in terms of the public response remains to be seen. Certainly it's becoming a political issue, a wedge issue perhaps, locally and maybe provincially and possibly nationally. But political wedge issues don't necessarily translate into sort of the public perspective and public mood. So I think we need to be careful to rushing to conclusions about that. So I think we'll be continuing to study this with our research, and I'm sure there'll be more research that will be unfolding. I think the only point I want to make is that the debate around asylum seekers and refugees right now, in Canada, the debate, so to speak, is primarily around the resources, where we're going to put them, what are we going to do with them, and so forth. The focus is primarily on how are we going to effectively absorb these individuals, and not so much on who they are. There's very little discussion about these people being undesirable or people that we don't want in our country. And it's very different from other countries in the United States and Europe, where the debate is not so much about absorbing them as much as these are people we don't want.
Right. Thank you very much, Keith. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions that cluster together around perceptions and behaviors. So excellent presentation, Keith, and thank you to the CRRF for hosting. You're welcome. My question is, given the current lack of civility in much of our public discourse on the issues you raised, how do we move forward with the notion that protecting agreed upon norms of behavior may be enough, even if our values and beliefs may be very different?
Well, that's a complex question. I guess what I would suggest is that I think that the norms, I think the evidence suggests to me that the norms around behavior and civility in Canada are still largely intact in terms of what is and what is not appropriate behavior. Certainly there are attitudes and values that are non-inclusive, that may be racist or intolerant, but largely in the public sphere, most of that is not being acted upon. So the norms are still there, and I would argue that they're more in place in Canada than they are in a number of other countries. And I think the opportunity is to reinforce and strengthen those, and that actually will make a difference. Now, how does that happen? It takes political leadership, leadership in all sectors. The media has a role to play. You know, I think to some extent, you know, by exposing people to, for instance, some of the data that we have, certainly public opinion and so forth, actually in and of itself is a strategy in the sense that, I mean, most individuals may know what they think and what they believe and what their friends and family may know, but they may not have a sense of what the broader population thinks and knows. And sometimes having a better understanding of that helps people connect to the broader society, and people may be surprised to know how much their attitudes and values are shared by others. And it's a way of connecting. So I think that it is possible that the norms could be reinforced. There needs to be a certain amount of political and other will to actually do this, so that you know, that sense of responsibility and so forth could be shared, and then individuals understanding about what is and was not acceptable behavior. You know, there'll be a better sense of where those boundaries are.
So what would, and this is a follow-up from another listener. So for those situations where you know, behaviors perhaps prove resistant to change, let's put it that way. So what does effective advocacy look like in terms of racism against indigenous persons, blacks, Muslims, Jews, and so forth?
Well, there's not a simple answer to that, and it really is context specific to particular situations. But the extent to which institutions at all levels and businesses and nonprofits and community organizations, the extent to which these organizations internally, in terms of their operations and their communications to people and others, the extent to which messages about the expectations of civility are communicated, those norms get strengthened. It's at an institutional level, it's at a social level in terms of informal groups and so forth. The extent to which inappropriate comments and so forth are not tolerated. You know, I think that a good example here is sexism and the Me Too movement. And we've seen dramatic change over the past year or so around treatment towards women. The Me Too movement has had a dramatic change on social norms around treatment, and I think are really changing behavior in a significant way. You know, the values and attitudes of men may not be changing dramatically, but I would argue that behavior probably is. And so that kind of process applied to other forms of discrimination or racism potentially could have the same kind of impact.
Excellent, thank you. Another question from our audience about intersectionality. Specifically, they were wondering a bit about the intersections of identity and the experiences of people who, for example, are LGBTQ2 and persons of color. Did the impact of these experiences show up in your research or your work?
In some cases, yes. I think that intersectionality, just to be clear, is people have multiple identities, and the intersection of those identities will play out in different ways, not only in how people live their lives, but how they are treated by others. So I think that's what we're talking about. It's a challenging thing to study because it's not always possible in every survey to map all of the relevant identities that may come into play. And certainly for our general population studies, for instance, many of the broad survey questions that I've presented, it's not possible when you're doing a representative sample of Canadians to have enough people in an LGBTQ or an Indigenous or a Black identities, to have enough of those in each one of these surveys to properly look at it. So it's a bit of a gap. That being said, for some of our studies, so for instance, our Black Experience Project, we were able to look at intersectionality because that was something that we put a priority on. And I couldn't go into the details in this presentation, and I can't really go into too many details here right now. But we're able to look at some of that, and we did find out, for instance, in the Black community, that those who identify as LGBTQ, their experiences, not in all cases, but in some cases, was more negative or was more challenging than people who were not in that group. So we do see some evidence of intersectionality, and I quite rightly agree that this is an important thing to focus on. And our research covers part of it, but there's much more that can be done there.
Okay. Great. Okay, a comment from one of our participants reads as follows. Perhaps the conversation surrounding asylum seekers focuses on resources, housing, etc., because it's not socially acceptable to say that we don't want them. But the more generic topics of conversation can be covering an ugly underbelly that is very racist. What do you think?
Well, that could be the case. I think that yes, that there could be that aspect to it, and it's very difficult to measure that, to uncover it, to say for sure to what extent. That being said, I think that that actually illustrates the point about social norms. There may be that underbelly of negativity that's not being expressed because those people may understand or believe that they can't express it. I guess the point is that that distinction is actually an important distinction, and that actually how people behave is actually the more important part than what they may think to themselves. And the extent to which those norms hold may mean that they may think negatively towards these groups, but if they don't raise that, and if our leaders don't raise that, it may not be that much of a problem, and that those people that may have those negative views, their views may eventually change over time or modify. And I guess the only other point I want to make is in other countries, those norms are not holding. And so in the United States, in some countries in Europe, people feel quite free to say, we don't want those kinds of people. And I think the final point, if I may go on, is that the most significant number of people coming in as asylum seekers right now, as I understand, are coming from Nigeria. And these are actually people who are very different from the Syrians. And most Canadians don't know who's coming across the border. But these Nigerians, in fact, if their profile were properly communicated and shared, might not actually be as much of a concern as we might imagine. Okay,
thank you. Okay, so a few more, we have a couple of other questions. First one is, so when we look across the border to our American friends, how is what is happening in the United States with immigrants and refugees affecting now, or likely to affect, what's happening here in Canada?
Good question. Hard to know for sure. I don't think our research or any research could necessarily tell us for sure. I think there are a couple of things. I think you know, Canadians have always had a bit of an ambivalent view towards the United States. And I think at some level, many Canadians may be looking across the border and feel a combination of horror and perhaps superiority of some sort, or saying, well, at least we're not like that, and maybe reinforcing a sense that we are or can or should be doing better. And so it may emphasize that difference. We do know that Canadians' opinions in the United States are lower today than they have ever been in the past 50 or 60 years based on our surveys. And certainly I think the current U.S. administration and some of their policies about immigration and so forth is certainly a big part of that. So I think that's part of the reaction. On the other hand, I think that the people that buy into that third narrative that I spoke of, I think in some level may feel emboldened. Those people that have very negative views towards immigrants and refugees and people who are other, I think some of them may look to the U.S. and feel a sense of strength and maybe a sense that, well, gee, maybe, you know, we can be more expressive in our own views. So it runs the risk of expanding that third narrative in this country more than it has before.
Okay, great. One last question, although we do encourage folks to, to please offer up their questions. We still have some time, and Keith does not appear to be edging away from his screen. And do you have any thoughts about how, I mean, if you were a kind of person who simply relies on what you read in the media, okay, how would you compare the results of your finding with what the media is telling us about Canadian attitudes?
Well, I think there's quite a difference. I think first off, the media doesn't doesn't do a lot of reporting. I mean, most of the research that I've shown today, it's all in the public domain. Very few bits of it have actually been in the media at any level. And I think that it's for two reasons. I think I'm trying to provide a nuanced picture, and even that I provided only slivers of it. The media, as it's constructed generally and as it's focused today, isn't very strong on nuance, and it's very difficult to communicate the sorts of points I'm making through media sources, even the more the more nuanced ones. And I think it's also fair to say that the media tends to focus much more on negative stories than positive stories. I think it's a function of what drives media hits and eyeballs and revenue. I don't think it's the Canadian media. I don't think any particular sources are particularly responsible. But the nature of the dynamic is that bad stories are going to capture much more attention. The media is going to pay more attention. So polls and surveys with negative results are going to be given more prominence. So there's a big divide between the research that I've shown you and other studies that others have done and what's in the media, because the media is basically playing to these narratives that I've been talking about, and I think edges towards the more negative side because that's just easier to sell and so forth. And so I think certainly what we see in the media, it doesn't mean it's wrong, it doesn't mean it's incorrect or fake, as they say, but it's one and possibly somewhat distorted picture of where Canadians are, because there's much more to it than what they can or will present.
Thank you, Keith. I'm just waiting for the Q&A panel to appear. There's one last question, and this is from Icam O'Para from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. They wanted to know if the question is coming from them, so that you don't interpret it as being hostile.
Fair enough.
Which is sometimes a good sign that hostility is coming, but I don't think in this case.
Okay.
And it reads as follows. I guess I'm still struggling with this issue of norms. These norms, to me, may end up being a shiny veneer over dearly held antipathy that gives us a kind of low-grade détente, which, in my opinion, leaves us prone to being manipulated by rhetoric for political or nationalist gains.
Well, that's a good question. I think that maybe what you're suggesting is that there's the danger or potential for norms to be manipulated or kind of pushed in a certain direction by people with agendas that may be unfortunate. I guess it's, yes, there is the potential or the risk. Certainly, norms are not necessarily positive. They're norms that could be very destructive or negative norms as well. So they go in both directions. So there's certainly dangers with respect to where norms might take us. So yes, I think that's true. I guess maybe the point I'd like to end with or emphasize here is that I think in Canada today, there are norms, social norms established around civility and acceptance and tolerance that have strengthened over the past several generations, that have become much more positive than they were before, and I think that's part of what our data is showing. and that they are reasonably coherent in this point in time, and that there are ways that they could be reinforced in that positive direction, or at least maintained against forces that might be working against them. And so that there's an opportunity in Canada today to hold on to what we've got and maybe strengthen them further. That takes a certain conscious effort. And maybe that should be a priority. And to diminish the danger that norms might slip away into something else. So I'm not sure that fully addresses the point you're making, but at least is an initial response, and I hope it takes us partway there.
Thank you very much, Keith. We have no other questions, so I think you've answered all of them, and we certainly hope that as the Environics Institute does additional survey and more research, we'll be able to have the pleasure of you coming back to join us again.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure and our pleasure. For the participants, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Thank you for your questions and your attention. We also remind you that tomorrow, that is Friday the 13th, the Racial Relations Foundation will be holding another webinar on a different topic, this one focusing on radicalization and homegrown terrorism. We invite you to register for this seminar as well, if you have not already done so. But until the next time, we thank you all for your participation, and a little bit early, we wish you a great and pleasant weekend. Thank you all.